In the vast theater of Roman history, certain figures stand like pillars of brilliance. Augustus, who forged an empire from chaos. Trajan, who carried Rome to its greatest expanse. Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher king. But among these towering names, one drips not with glory, but with infamy. Gaius Julius Caesar, Augustus Germanicus, remembered forever by his childhood nickname, Caligula. The name alone curdles the blood. To the Romans, it became synonymous with tyranny, depravity, and madness. A reign so grotesque that even a society accustomed to crucifixion and gladiatorial slaughter whispered his deeds as if fearing to summon his ghost. But before he became the emperor who reveled in humiliation, incest, and sadistic murder, Caligula was a child shaped by the poison of the dynasty into which he was born. The Julio-Claudian dynasty was no ordinary lineage. It was a garden of power watered with blood. His great-grandfather Augustus had founded the Principate not through gentle reform, but through civil war, purges, and ruthless control. His grandfather Tiberius, dour and suspicious, had ruled Rome through paranoia and terror, retreating to his island fortress on Capri, while his agents strangled, poisoned, and exiled rivals by the dozens. Into this world of knives and shadows, Caligula was born in 12 AD, the third of 6 children to Germanicus, Rome's most beloved general, and Agrippina the elder. Germanicus, handsome and charismatic, seemed destined to rule, adored by the legions, but that very popularity sealed his fate. In 19 AD, he died suddenly in Syria, the whispers of poison pointing directly to Tiberius, who could not abide a rival's glory. The orphan boy grew up in a crucible of grief and suspicion, yet for a time, he was adored. Germanicus had often taken his family to the military frontiers, and the child Gaius was dressed in miniature legionary armor by his mother. The hardened soldiers of the Rhine laughed and doted on him, calling him Caligula, Little Boot. What began as affection carried a cruel irony. The nickname that once symbolized innocence and charm would in time become synonymous with monstrous cruelty. Already the boy was absorbing the lessons of Roman life. That glory was forged in blood, that loyalty was a commodity, and that survival meant masking ambition until the perfect moment arrived. As Tiberius aged, paranoia consumed him. Caligula's mother Agrippina was accused of treason, exiled, and starved to death. His brothers, Nero and Drusus, were imprisoned and killed. The young Caligula survived only by seeming harmless, a theatrical dilettante, a boy too frivolous to pose a threat. But Tiberius saw deeper. He reportedly remarked, "I am nursing a viper for the Roman people." That prophecy would prove grimly accurate. When Tiberius died in 37 AD, some say smothered by Caligula himself, the viper uncoiled. At only 24 years old, Caligula was thrust upon the throne of the most powerful empire in the world. At first, Rome rejoiced. The Senate, suffocated by Tiberius's reign of terror, welcomed the young prince with open arms. Citizens celebrated in the streets. Caligula appeared as a savior, recalling exiles, releasing prisoners, publishing the imperial budget, and lavishing games upon the people. He distributed vast sums to the Praetorian Guard, the urban cohorts, and even the fire brigades, buying loyalty with the blood money of his predecessor. Chariot races thundered through the Circus Maximus. Gladiators clashed in the arena. Exotic beasts were slaughtered in the sand to the roars of tens of thousands. To the people, he was a generous patron. To the Senate, a refreshing contrast to Tiberius. But to those watching closely, there were already cracks in the facade. His laughter at executions was too long, too genuine. He lingered over the sight of blood pooling in the sand. Palace servants whispered that he would walk the empty amphitheater alone at night, retracing the paths where men had died only hours before. The seeds of madness were already sprouting. 8 months into his reign, fate struck. Caligula fell gravely ill. The ancient sources describe fever, delirium, and seizures, symptoms that modern scholars have linked to epilepsy, encephalitis, or perhaps a form of brain damage. For weeks, Rome held its breath. Citizens held torchlit vigils, praying to the gods for his recovery. Some even vowed to sacrifice their own lives if their emperor survived. The irony is cruel. Their prayers were answered, but in saving his body, the gods seem to have destroyed his soul. When Caligula rose from his sickbed, something had changed. His voice had grown harsh, his eyes burned with a manic intensity, and he claimed to speak directly with Jupiter himself. The young emperor, who had once been adored as Rome's golden hope, returned as something altogether darker. A man who would soon blur the line between human and divine, sanity and madness. The people had prayed for Caligula's survival, and the gods had granted their wish. But what had risen from that sickbed was not the same man. It was the beginning of Rome's nightmare. When Caligula returned from the jaws of death in 37 AD, the man who emerged was no longer the beloved Prince of Rome. The illness had burned away whatever softness remained, leaving behind a creature of cruelty, paranoia, and divine delusion. Palace officials whispered of his unsettling new presence. His voice, once charming, now grated harshly against the ear. His eyes seemed to bore straight through men rather than meet them. And worst of all, he spoke of visions, claiming that Jupiter himself appeared to him in the night, commanding him with celestial authority. It was the perfect delusion for a man holding absolute power, to believe himself not merely emperor, but god. Caligula's divine pretensions began subtly. At first he appeared before the Senate in Augustus' lavish costumes. Jupiter with thunderbolt in hand, Neptune with trident, even Venus painted and perfumed in women's robes. Senators were forced to prostrate themselves, crawling on their hands and knees to kiss his feet before daring to speak. Soon, temples across the empire received statues of Caligula, with the heads of gods removed and replaced with his own likeness. Sacrifices once offered to Jupiter or Mars were now made to the emperor himself. For Romans, this was an abomination. Worship of emperors after death was common, but living divinity was unthinkable. To Caligula, hesitation equaled treason. Citizens who failed to show sufficient enthusiasm in his worship faced confiscation of property, exile, or execution. Rome's civic religion had been twisted into a theater of submission, where every prayer, every sacrifice, every bowed head reinforced the emperor's fantasy. But the most disturbing symbol of Caligula's delusion came not in temples, but in his own household. His sister Drusilla, by all accounts his favorite, was forced to divorce her husband and live with him as his consort. Ancient historians whispered that he paraded her openly as his wife, engaging in incest that shocked even the jaded aristocracy of Rome. When Drusilla died suddenly in 38 AD, the emperor's grief curdled into mania. He declared her a goddess, Diva Drusilla, and made denial of her divinity a capital crime. For months, Rome was plunged into a grotesque mourning. To laugh, to dine with family, even to bathe was forbidden. Those who disobeyed risked death. The boundary between private perversion and public tyranny had collapsed. Caligula's personal obsessions had become Rome's law. Paranoia soon stalked every corner of the palace. Caligula claimed to see conspiracies in his dreams. And what he dreamed, Rome paid for in blood. Marcus Junius Silanus, a respected senator, was ordered to commit suicide after appearing threatening in one of the emperor's visions. Others followed, condemned not for crimes of action, but of imagination. It became a grim truth in Rome. If you appeared in the emperor's nightmares, the Praetorian Guard might appear at your door the next morning. Never before had Rome lived under a ruler who blurred the line between dream and law, fantasy and execution. The Senate, once the heart of Roman governance, became a stage for Caligula's sadistic theater. He ridiculed senators in public, forced them to grovel like slaves, and executed those who hesitated in their worship. At dinners, he would laugh and converse with senators like equals, then suddenly order one to be dragged away and killed for some imagined slight. Others were forced to run alongside his chariot until they collapsed, executed if they faltered. Perhaps his most notorious insult came when he announced his intention to appoint his horse, Incitatus, as consul. The horse lived in a marble stable, fed from an ivory manger, and wore purple blankets, the color of imperial authority. What sounded like eccentric comedy was, in truth, deliberate degradation. By elevating a beast above Rome's statesmen, Caligula revealed his true contempt for the Senate. They were less than animals to him. Fear became Rome's currency. The palace turned into a labyrinth of suspicion, where courtiers measured every breath, every glance, every silence, for fear of offending the emperor. To speak was dangerous. To remain silent, equally fatal. He would host banquets of dazzling splendor, tables laden with gold, delicacies from every corner of the empire, music and laughter filling the halls. But at any moment, the feast could turn into a funeral. A guest might be ordered executed mid-course, their property confiscated to feed Caligula's extravagance. The laughter of the court grew brittle, every smile forced, every compliment desperate. The Senate chamber, once the proud arena of Roman debate, had become a place where Rome's nobility bent and broke under one man's whim. By now, Rome knew. The emperor was no longer human in his own mind. He was a god, demanding sacrifice, and soon he would demand not only obedience, but flesh. If Caligula's claim to divinity revealed his delusion, it was in his private chambers and in his public feasts that his cruelty mutated into something more monstrous. Rome had long tolerated decadence among its elites. Banquets, mistresses, even scandalous affairs were expected of emperors. But Caligula twisted these indulgences into tools of domination, making sex and spectacle not about pleasure, but about power. The imperial palace ceased to be the dignified residence of a ruler and became instead a sprawling brothel of subjugation. Senators, knights, and their families were summoned not for counsel, but for violation. Wives were dragged from their husbands' sides, raped before their eyes, and then mocked for their performance. Husbands were forced to smile, nod, and praise the emperor's skill, or face execution. According to Suetonius, Caligula would parade noblewomen into dinner parties, inspect them like livestock, and then disappear with them into adjoining chambers while their humiliated husbands waited at table. When he returned, he would deliver detailed commentary on their performance, forcing husbands to agree with his judgments, as though it were a matter of politics. rather than intimacy. For Rome's nobility, survival now required not only silence in the Senate, but degradation in the bedchamber. At Caligula's banquets, humiliation was the main course. He forced elderly senators to strip naked and perform sexual acts with slaves, while guests continued eating as if nothing were amiss. Aristocrats were compelled to serve as actors in obscene performances, each degradation greeted by the emperor's roaring laughter. What horrified Romans most was not merely the obscenity, but its ritual nature. To Caligula, sex was never private. It was spectacle, an act of power, displayed like blood in the arena. Caligula cloaked his perversions in the language of religion. He claimed that his sexual acts were sacred rites required by the gods. Women were forced to worship his body as divine. Men were compelled to perform oral service as if it were communion with the emperor god. These ceremonies blended sex, humiliation, and blasphemy into a single grotesque performance. To refuse was to defy not just the emperor, but the gods he claimed to embody. A crime punishable by death. Perhaps most shocking of all were the whispers that Caligula's lust respected no boundary of age. Ancient sources record that the young daughters of senators and equestrians were summoned to his chambers, some barely past childhood, their parents forced to watch in silence. What should have been Rome's future was defiled in its present, leaving scars not only on families, but on the very moral fabric of the empire. For Caligula, there was no sacred, no family bond, no religious taboo, no civic dignity. Every boundary existed only to be shattered. But cruelty alone could not sustain his rule. To fund his orgies, his games, and his delusions of grandeur, Caligula plundered Rome's wealth with reckless abandon. The massive surplus left by Tiberius, estimated in the billions of sesterces, evaporated within a year, spent on spectacles, feasts, and construction projects designed to glorify his divine status. When the treasury ran dry, Caligula turned predatory. He revived the dreaded treason trials, not to purge enemies, but to confiscate the fortunes of Rome's wealthy. Accusation was enough to mean death, and every estate, every villa, every coin flowed into the emperor's coffers. No one was safe. To be rich was to be guilty. When even these plunderings proved insufficient, Caligula's desperation grew grotesque. He taxed lawsuits, marriages, and divorces. He taxed prostitution and gambling. He even devised a levy for those who wished to remain silent during his speeches. Silence itself becoming a taxable commodity. Most bizarre of all, citizens were required to pay for the privilege of breathing in his presence. To inhale the same air as the emperor was to owe him tribute. In Rome, life itself became a taxable offense. And then came the insult that would echo through history. Caligula's decision to appoint his horse, Incitatus, to the consulship, the highest civil office of Rome. The horse lived in a marble stable, dined from an ivory manger, and was attended by slaves. Draped in purple, the color of kings, Incitatus was paraded as a rival to senators who had once commanded legions and governed provinces. Was it a joke? A deliberate humiliation, or a final declaration that Rome's proud Senate was beneath the hooves of his horse? Whatever the truth, the message was clear. The dignity of the Republic was dead. Rome bled. Its treasury was empty, its nobility degraded, its gods mocked. But Caligula's hunger was insatiable, and soon that hunger would turn outward, to the legions, to the provinces, and to war. Rome's empire was built on conquest, disciplined legions marching across continents, generals carving provinces from barbarian lands. Caligula, though he had never truly commanded in war, declared himself the greatest general Rome had ever known. His campaigns, however, would prove less martial triumph and more theater of madness. In 39 AD, Caligula led an expedition north to the Rhine frontier, where Roman legions had long battled the Germanic tribes. Soldiers expected battle, but instead their emperor ordered humiliating spectacles. Centurions, hardened veterans of decades, were forced to strip naked and crawl in the mud for his amusement. Senior officers were made to run alongside his chariot until they collapsed, executed if they showed weakness. Then came his most infamous act. At the shores of Gaul, facing the Channel, Caligula ordered his legions to line the beaches in battle formation. Trumpets blared, standards waved, but there was no enemy. Instead, he commanded the soldiers to charge into the surf, to collect seashells. These, he declared, are the spoils of war, the treasures of Neptune. The soldiers obeyed, humiliated, stuffing their tunics with shells while their emperor proclaimed a triumph over the sea itself. Rome's proud legions, conquerors of nations, reduced to gathering pebbles like children on a beach. This was more than mockery. It was sacrilege. The legions were Rome's backbone, its most sacred institution. By degrading them, Caligula struck at the heart of Rome's identity. Yet desertion was impossible. To disobey was death not only for the soldier, but often for his family as well. Even the Praetorian Guard, sworn protectors of the emperor, grew weary of his excesses. They had been forced to carry out executions of nobles on fabricated charges, to enforce humiliating taxes, to stand guard over orgies that debased Rome's aristocracy. Loyalty had soured into hatred. Among them was Cassius Chaerea, a senior centurion. A career soldier, Chaerea was mocked relentlessly by Caligula, who jeered at his soft voice, calling him Priapus and Venus, crude insults designed to emasculate him. Chaerea's humiliation was personal, but his outrage was shared by all who served under the emperor's madness. By 41 AD, the empire itself seemed ready to collapse under the weight of Caligula's insanity. The Senate, the equestrian class, even freedmen in the palace whispered of rebellion. But it was Chaerea who forged whispers into steel. The plan was simple, precise, and deadly. The conspirators studied Caligula's movements, identifying a narrow underground passage beneath the Palatine Palace where he would be most vulnerable, separated from his Germanic bodyguards. The final straw came when Caligula announced plans to move permanently to Alexandria, where he could be worshipped as a living god without the restraints of Roman tradition. He spoke openly of massacring the entire Senate, replacing it with new magistrates, and with his horse. Rome had survived mad emperors before, but this was not mere madness. It was the planned destruction of the state itself. The conspirators knew if they did not act now, Rome would cease to exist as they knew it. January 24th, 41 AD. The Palatine Games filled the theater with music, actors, and spectacle. Caligula laughed uproariously at scenes of betrayal and murder, blind to the irony that the same fate awaited him. When the performance ended, he left for lunch, choosing to take the shortcut through the underground corridor, the conspirators' killing ground. Chaerea struck first, driving his sword into the emperor's jaw and neck. Caligula staggered, shrieking in disbelief. Others rushed forward, stabbing again and again, each blade carrying years of humiliation, rage, and grief. According to Suetonius, he suffered 30 wounds before collapsing in a crimson pool. His final words, defiant, pathetic, were, "I am still alive." Moments later, he was not. The god was dead. The man was exposed, and Rome exhaled. The palace erupted in chaos. Caligula's Germanic guards, furious, cut down several conspirators in retaliation. Senators scattered in fear, uncertain whether they'd been liberated or doomed. For hours, Rome teetered on the brink of civil war. The conspirators had slain the tyrant, but they had not planned what came next. It was the Praetorians who stumbled upon a solution. Hiding behind a curtain in the palace, they found Claudius, Caligula's uncle. Stammering, awkward, long dismissed as a fool, Claudius was dragged before the guard and proclaimed emperor. Rome, shaken but intact, had survived. The Senate declared damnatio memoriae, the condemnation of memory. Caligula's statues were smashed, inscriptions defaced, his name scraped from official records. Rome tried desperately to erase him, as if forgetting might heal the wound. But the erasure was never complete. His reign remained a whispered scar in Rome's memory, a reminder of how quickly civilization could crumble when power fell into the wrong hands. Historians would wrestle for centuries with Caligula's legacy. Was he mad from illness, a product of trauma and paranoia? Or was he simply proof of what absolute power can do when stripped of all restraint? The truth may be all three. What mattered to Rome, and what matters to us, is the lesson. Civilization is fragile. Institutions are only as strong as the men who uphold them. When fear replaces law, when spectacle replaces justice, when one man's delusion replaces reality, society itself teeters on the edge of collapse. Caligula reigned for only 4 years. Yet in that short time, he revealed the darkest truth about human nature. That the line between ruler and monster is perilously thin, and that unchecked power can corrupt not just a man, but an entire empire.